On a difficult night at the police station, Officer Logan Carter points a gun at Chief Daniel Lawson, motivated by rage. But Lawson remains faithful, transforming that moment into a reckoning. Amidst the dense crowd, Callister realizes he has no one protect him this time. This is more than just a story of a dishonest police officer being removed. It is also a message about accountability and the terrible quiet of an entire institution. One night changes everything, and this time, justice is not forgotten. The air inside the police station was thick with the usual scent of burnt coffee and the faint musk of uniforms worn for too many hours. The night shift was winding down, and the officers who had been out on patrol were dragging themselves back in, eager to log their reports and get home. But inside the station, something was about to happen that no one would ever forget. Officer Logan Carter was not an easy man to like. Tall, broad, and with a permanent scowl etched into his pale face, he carried an arrogance that clung to him like the stench of gunpowder. He had been on the force for 15 years, long enough to feel untouchable. He spoke with the kind of authority that made rookies nervous, and when he walked to the halls, people stepped aside, whether they respected him or feared him. The truth was, many suspected what kind of man Carter was. But in a profession where silence was often the safest option, no one said much. That was until tonight. He strode into the squad room, his black boots clicking against the floor. His shift had been uneventful, and his patience was wearing thin. He hated the new policies that had been rolling in, talks of reform, diversity training, accountability. He sneered at the words, saw them as an insult to him. The station was changing in ways he didn't approve of, and the man responsible for that change had just walked through the front doors. Police Chief Daniel Lawson was a towering figure in his own right, but where Carter's presence felt like a storm waiting to break, Lawson carried himself like a steady mountain, unshaken, immovable. His brown skin contrasted sharply against the deep navy of his uniform, the 4 silver stars on his collar catching the dim overhead lights. He was the first black police chief this department had ever had, and that fact alone was enough to make some officers like Carter fume. Carter watched as Chief Lawson entered, his fingers twitching slightly at his side, brushing against his holster. The way the man walked, the quiet authority he had, it made Carter's blood boil. The station wasn't supposed to be run by someone like him. Lawson turned toward the break room, casually greeting a few officers who gave him polite nods before continuing about their business. But Carter didn't move. He just stood there, staring at the man, something dark and boiling inside him. And then, as if possessed by a moment of madness or clarity, depending on how deep his prejudice ran, Carter reached for his gun. It wasn't hesitation. It wasn't confusion. It was deliberate. The movement was sharp, practiced, and terrifyingly quick. In one swift motion, he pulled his service weapon from its holster and leveled it straight at Lawson back. Hands where I can see them. The words sliced through the room like a knife. The officers nearby froze, their eyes darting between Carter and the police chief. The tension snapped in an instant, sending the entire station into a shock paralysis. Lawson stopped walking, but he didn't raise his hands. Instead, he turned slowly, deliberately, until his eyes locked onto Carter's. And that was when everything changed. A heavy silence settled over the station. The air conditioning hummed in the background, the only sound in a room full of officers who were too stunned to move. Every set of eyes locked onto the scene unfolding before them. Officer Logan Carter, standing with his gun drawn, aimed directly at the police chief. Chief Daniel Lawson didn't flinch. His face remained unreadable, his eyes locked onto Carter's with an intensity that made the younger officer's fingers twitch on the trigger. Lawson's hands remained at his sides, relaxed, as though he had all the time in the world. Officer Carter. His voice was calm, steady, put the weapon down. Carter's lips curled. His knuckles whitened around the grip of his gun. I said, hands where I can see them. Carter barked, his voice laced, with something deep in authority. Fear. No, not fear, hatred. Muffled whispers rippled through the squad room, officers shifting uncomfortably in their seats, their hands hovering near their own holsters. But no one made a move. No one wanted to be the one to escalate this further. Lawson remained still, tilting his head just slightly. His dark eyes studied Carter. Not with fear, Not even with anger, but something closer to disappointment, as if he'd seen men like him before, as if he'd already anticipated this moment long before it happened. "I have no idea what kind of power you think you have here, officer," Lawson said slowly, his deep voice carrying across the room like a low thunderclap. "But you are making a mistake. When you won't walk away from," Carter scoffed, a vein bulging in his temple. His grip on the gun didn't waver. "You don't belong here," he spat. The words came out before he could stop them, and there it was, the truth, ugly and raw, slipping out like poison. A few of the officers standing nearby inhaled sharply. The room, somehow, became even heavier. Lawson's lips pressed together. Then he exhaled, shaking his head slightly. "I see," he murmured. "So this isn't about protocol, is it? It's not about law or procedure." He took a step closer, just one, slow and deliberate. "It's about the fact that you can't stand to see a black man in charge." The accusation cut through the air like a blade. Carter's nostrils flared. "I don't take orders from..." "From what?" Lawson interrupted, his voice a low warning now. "Say it." The weight of the moment pressed down on every officer in the room. The ones who had been pretending not to see Carter's behavior. The ones who had dismissed his remarks in the locker room. The ones who had let things slide because that's just how Carter is. They saw it now, laid bare for what it really was, pure unfiltered racism. And then, before Carter could even register what was happening, Lawson took another step forward, bold, unshaken, and in a move so fast it left everyone breathless. He reached out and grabbed the barrel of Carter's gun with his bare hand. The entire room gasped. Carter's mouth fell open. He yanked back, instinctively trying to pull the weapon away. But Reeves' grip was iron. "You're not in control anymore," Reeves said, his voice dangerously low. And then, with one sharp movement, he twisted the gun out of Carter's grip. The sharp clatter of the gun hitting the floor echoed through the station like a gunshot. Officers flinched, their hands instinctively twitching toward their holsters. But no one moved. No one spoke. The only sound in the room was the labored breathing of Officer Carter, his face a mask of disbelief, humiliation, and rage. Chief Daniel Lawson stood before him, the weapon no longer in Carter's hands, but at his feet. It was over in an instant, yet the weight of what had just happened loomed over them like a storm cloud. Lawson's expression didn't change, calm, measured, but there was a fire behind his eyes now, controlled but burning bright. Carter's breath came fast, his chest heaving as his hands curled into trembling fists. The room was suffocating, the realization dawning on him that he had just made the worst mistake of his life. "Pick it up." The words came from Lawson, but they weren't a request. They weren't even a challenge. They were a command. Carter's lips pressed into a thin line. His eyes flickered to the gun lying between them. Then back to Lawson. "I said..." Lawson continued stepping closer, his voice carrying the full weight of his authority. "Pick it up, officer." But Carter didn't move. He couldn't. He was paralyzed, not out of fear, but out of something worse. Humiliation. For the first time in his career, for the first time in his life, he wasn't in control. He wasn't the one with the power, and the entire station was watching. A few officers exchanged glances, silent conversations passing between them. Some looked guilty, some shocked, but a few, just a few, looked relieved, as if, finally, someone had done what should have been done a long time ago. Lawson waited a moment longer before he sighed, bending down slowly. He picked up the gun himself, examining it with a cold, professional gaze. Then, in a motion deliberate and slow, he removed the magazine, ejected the bullet from the chamber, and placed the empty weapon on the nearest desk. "Unbelievable," Lawson murmured, shaking his head as he looked Carter in the eye. "You walk around this station with that badge on your chest, telling yourself you're the law, but all you are is a coward with a gun." Carter's jaw tightened, his nostrils flaring. "You, shut up." The words cut through the air like a blade, and for the first time Carter did. His mouth snapped shut, his skin burning with the realization that he had no idea what was about to happen next. Chief Lawson straightened his uniform, turning slightly to the rest of the officers in the room, making eye contact with each of them. "Every last one of you saw that," he said, his voice carrying a sharp edge. "Every last one of you knows what just happened here. His eyes narrowed slightly. And I want to know who in this room believes this man is fit to wear that badge. No one spoke. Carter swallowed hard, his face growing redder by the second. He turned his gaze toward the officers around him, his so-called brothers in blue, but none of them met his eyes. For the first time in his life, Logan Carter was alone. Lawson exhaled, a look of deep disappointment settling on his face. That's what I thought. Then without another word, he reached into his pocket, pulled out his radio, and pressed a button. Internal Affairs, this is Chief Lawson. I need you down at the station immediately. We have a situation. Carter's breath hitched, his eyes widened, and just like that, the walls started to close in. The silence in the room thickened, stretching out like an invisible noose around Carter's neck. The color drained from his face as the weight of those 5 words settled over him. We have a situation. His mouth opened, but nothing came out, no excuse, no protest, no words to save himself. Because deep down he knew there was nothing he could say. The other officers still hadn't moved. Some were watching the chief with unreadable expressions, others looking at Carter like they were seeing him for the first time. The old shield of silent loyalty was cracking, and it terrified him more than anything else. The radio crackled to life. Copy that, Chief. ETA 5 minutes, 0.5 minutes. Carter's heart pounded against his ribs. His mind screamed at him to do something, to say something, to regain control of the situation. But what was there to say? That he thought Lawson was an intruder, that he felt threatened, that it was just a misunderstanding. He had pulled a gun on the police chief, in a station full of witnesses, and now the clock was ticking. Lawson still hadn't moved, his stance as steady as ever. He watched Carter, but there was no satisfaction in his gaze, no smugness, no triumph, just something heavier. Do you understand what's about to happen? Lawson finally asked, his voice quiet, measured. Carter swallowed, his throat dry, his mind raced for some kind of escape, some kind of way out, but every door had slammed shut. You're done, Lawson continued. You pulled a weapon on a superior officer in a police station. That alone is enough to end your career. But the reason why, he shook his head, his expression tightening, that's going to follow you for the rest of your life. Carter felt his breath catch, the rest of his life. His knees felt weak, but his pride, what little was left, kept him standing. He tried to find anger, some kind of righteous fury to latch onto, but all he found was emptiness. You're making a mistake, he said, but the words came out hollow. Lawson raised an eyebrow. The mistake was yours, officer, and now you'll face the consequences. The distant sound of approaching sirens seeped through the walls, growing louder with each second, and in that moment Carter realized this was it. There would be no backing out, no covering up, no quiet reassignment to another precinct. Not this time. He turned his head slightly, scanning the faces of the officers he had worked alongside for years, waiting, hoping for someone to step forward, to defend him, to say something, but they didn't. Some looked at the floor, some stared straight ahead, and some, he realized with a sinking dread, looked relieved. For the first time, Logan Carter truly understood what it felt like to be powerless. And as the sirens grew closer, drowning out the last of his illusions, he knew his time was up. The sirens wailed louder, their piercing shrieks bouncing off the concrete walls of the station, and with every second that passed, Carter's fate sealed itself tighter around him. His breathing was shallow now, chest rising and falling too quickly as his mind scrambled for a way out, a way to turn the tide. But there was no tide left to turn. Chief Lawson hadn't moved, hadn't flinched, hadn't even blinked as the reality of the moment crashed down on the officer before him. His hands were still at his sides, his posture unwavering, but the weight of his presence had calluses shrinking. The doors to the station burst open with a rush of cold night air as 2 internal affairs officers stepped in. Their black windbreakers bore the unmistakable bold white lettering IAD. All eyes followed them as they walked to the squad room, their expressions unreadable, their movements precise and professional. One of them, a sharp-eyed black woman with short, cropped hair and the kind of no-nonsense demeanor that made officers straighten their backs on instinct, spotted Chief Lawson. Immediately one of them, a sharp-eyed black woman with short, cropped hair and the kind of no-nonsense demeanor that made officers straighten their backs on instinct, spotted Chief Lawson immediately. She strode toward him, clipboard in hand. "Chief," she greeted, her eyes flicking from him to Carter, assessing the scene with practiced efficiency. Lawson nodded. "Detective Rivera." He then turned his head slightly toward Carter, as if presenting him without words. Detective Rivera followed his gaze, and when she landed on Carter, her lips pressed into a thin line. There was no surprise in her expression, no shock, just the look of someone who had seen this kind of thing before. Carter's jaw clenched. She didn't even need to hear the full story. She already knew. "Officer Carter," she said, her voice carrying the weight of inevitability. "Turn around." His heart pounded, hammering against his ribs like a drum. This wasn't happening. This couldn't be happening. "I didn't." "Turn around." The command came sharp at this time, slicing through any weak protest he might have had. His pulse roared in his ears, his body tensed, locked between resistance and resignation. He had power once, influence, control. He was the one who made others afraid, and now it was gone. Slowly, his hands curled into fists at his sides, then released as he turned. The weight of every stare in the room bore down on his back, and for the first time he understood this was what it felt like to be judged before you even had a chance. The weight of every stare in the room bore down on his back, and for the first time he understood. This was what it felt like to be judged before you even had a chance to speak. The cold steel of the cuff snapped around his wrists, and just like that, Logan Carter was no longer an officer, just another man in shackles. The station, so full of murmurs before, fell into a deep, suffocating silence. No one stepped in. No one objected, because no one wanted to. The station, so full of murmurs before, fell into a deep, suffocating silence. No one stepped in, no one objected, because no one wanted to. Chief Lawson finally exhaled, but there was no victory in it, no triumph, just the weight of yet another battle fought in a war that never seemed to end. As Carter was led toward the door, his footsteps dragging, his once commanding presence reduced to something pitiful, he finally turned his head back toward Lawson, his face a twisted mess of disbelief, rage, and something dangerously close to fear. "This is your fault," he hissed under his breath. "You set me up." Lawson met his gaze with the unshakable calm of a man who had fought this fight 1,000 times before. "No, Carter," he said simply, "you set yourself up." And then the door swung open once more, and Logan Carter was marched out into the night. His career, his power, and the illusion of his untouchability crumbling with every step. The door slammed shut behind him, the echo ringing through the station like a final verdict. Logan Carter was gone, swallowed by the night, his fate now in the hands of internal affairs and the justice system he had once used to his advantage. But inside the station, the air remained thick with something unspoken. A weight that had been there for years, unacknowledged and ignored, had finally been dragged into the light. For the first time, the officers weren't just witnesses. They weren't just bystanders. They were participants, because their silence, their unwillingness to challenge men like Carter, had allowed this moment to happen, and now they had to face it. Chief Lawson slowly turned back toward the room, his gaze sweeping over the faces of the officers who remained. Some looked at him with newfound respect, some with shame, a few with resentment, their expressions tight with the uncomfortable realization that Carter was not the only one guilty of prejudice within these walls. But none of them said a word. Lawson let the silence linger, let them feel it, let them sit with the truth that had just unfolded before them. Then he finally spoke. "What happened tonight should never have happened," he said, his voice steady but firm. "Not in this department, not in this uniform." He let his gaze land on each officer, holding them in place with his words. "You may not have pulled the trigger, you may not have drawn the weapon, but ask yourselves, how many times did you look away?" The question hit like a hammer. Several officers shifted on their feet. A few dropped their gazes to the floor. Lawson nodded, his expression unreadable. "That's what I thought." Detective Rivera, who had been watching the exchange with quiet observation, finally stepped forward. "Chief," she said, her voice carrying the efficiency of someone who had long since stopped expecting justice to be easy. "Internal affairs will handle the case from here. Carter will be processed and will begin the investigation into his prior conduct immediately." Lawson gave a slow nod, Make sure it's thorough. Oh, you don't have to worry about that, Rivera replied, tucking her clipboard under her arm. The department's been needing to clean house for a long time. That at least was a small relief. But Lawson knew this was just the beginning. This wasn't just about one man with a gun and a dangerous mindset. This was about a system that had allowed it to fester. And now it was time to tear it down. He turned back to squad room, taking a step forward, his presence filling the space in a way that left no doubt. He was in charge now, and there would be no more Carters. Not under his watch. Go home, he said to the remaining officers. But understand this. When you come back tomorrow, this department will not be the same. With that, he turned, walking toward his office, leaving the station in a stunned silence once more, because for the first time in its history change had arrived. The station remained eerily quiet long after Chief Lawson disappeared into his office. Officers lingered, some exchanging uncertain glances, others deep in thought, as if trying to process the gravity of what had just taken place. Some were still in shock, not just at Carter's arrest, but at the why behind it, their own complicity, the cracks in the foundation of the very institution they had sworn to uphold. Others felt something different. Relief, a shift had taken place tonight, one that had been long overdue. Sergeant Mitchell, a veteran of the force who had kept his head down for too many years, finally exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face. Damn, he muttered under his breath. Should have happened a long time ago. Officer Torres, one of the younger officers who had always felt the unspoken weight of Carter's influence in the department, nodded slowly. We all knew, she admitted, we all knew what he was, and none of us said a damn thing. No one answered her, because there was no defense. Detective Rivera watched them, because there was no defense. Detective Rivera watched them, arms crossed, letting them stew in the reality of their own silence. You have to decide what kind of department you want to be, she said after a long pause, her voice even but sharp, because this was just the beginning. She didn't say more than that. She didn't need to. The message was clear. The doors to the station opened again, and this time, 2 officers from Internal Affairs stepped back in. One of them, a stern-looking man in his 50s, carried a thick folder under his arm. Detective Rivera, he said, nodding in greeting before glancing around the room. His gaze settled on the empty space where Carter had stood just minutes ago. We're going to need to pull everything on Carter. Every complaint, every incident report, every case he ever handled. Rivera smirked slightly, shaking her head. You're going to need a bigger folder. The IA officer let out a heavy sigh, as if he had expected that answer but dreaded it all the same. I thought so. And with that, the work began. Files were pulled. Reports were opened. The uncomfortable truth, buried for too long beneath paperwork and silence, was finally being dragged into the light. And as it happened, the officers left standing in that squad room had to make a choice. Would they continue to be silent, or would they finally be part of change? As Chief Lawson sat in his office, his hands folded before him, he knew this was far from over. But tonight was a start, and for the first time in years, the weight that had sat heavy on his shoulders felt just a little bit lighter. The station's fluorescent lights buzzed quietly, casting long shadows as the night deepened. Officers trickled out one by one, their conversations hushed, their minds still processing what had unfolded. Some lingered, flipping through reports with an unfamiliar sense of urgency, as if, for the first time, they truly saw the weight of their silence. Chief Daniel Lawson sat in his office, the heavy wooden door slightly ajar. Through the narrow opening, he could hear the muted voices of Internal Affairs sifting through Logan Carter's history, unearthing years of misconduct that had been buried under layers of indifference and complicity. It would be a long night for them, and for Carter, it would be even longer. The once feared officer, the man who had strutted through these halls as if they belonged to him, now sat in a holding cell downtown, stripped his badge, his gun, and the illusion of his power. The very system he had abused, the authority he had wielded as a weapon, had finally turned against him. Justice had come, not with rage, not with violence, but with something far more damning: accountability. Lawson leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. He was no stranger to nights like these, nights where battles had been fought and won, only for the war to stretch endlessly before him. But something felt different this time. This wasn't just a victory. This was a reckoning. A quiet knock on his office door pulled him from his thoughts. He turned his head to see Sergeant Mitchell standing there, looking more solemn than usual. "Chief," Mitchell said, hesitating for only a moment before stepping inside. I just want to say, I should have spoken up a long time ago." Lawson studied him, taking in the exhaustion in the older man's eyes. "But you didn't," Lawson said simply. Mitchell nodded. "No, I didn't." He swallowed hard. "But I will from now on." Lawson considered this. It would have been easy to dismiss Mitchell's words as too little, too late. But change didn't happen all at once. It wasn't a sweeping revolution. It was moments like this. One officer at a time, one choice at a time, until silence was no longer the easy option. Lawson nodded. "Good," he said. "See that you do." Mitchell gave a stiff nod before turning and leaving the office, the weight of his own words settling on his shoulders. Lawson turned back to his desk, but before he could return to the stack of papers waiting for him, another voice spoke from the doorway. "You think this is really the start of something?" Detective Rivera stood there now, arms crossed, watching him with an expression that was more knowing than questioning. Lawson considered the question, thought about the long road ahead, the work still to be done. Then, finally, he nodded. "I think it has to be." Rivera smirked slightly, shaking her head. "Guess we better get to work. Then," and with that, she disappeared down the hall, her footsteps fading into the quiet hum of the station. Lawson sat there for a moment longer, letting the silence settle, letting the weight of the night sink in. Then, with a slow, steady breath, he reached the first of many files that needed to be reviewed. There was still work to be done, but for the first time in a long time, he believed real change was coming. But for the first time in a long time, he believed real change was coming. And this time, nothing was going to stop it.